रजा फाउंडेशन और इंडिया हैबिटाट सेंटर के संयुक्त तत्वावधान में आज शाम आपका स्वागत है। रजा फाउंडेशन ने कुछ महीनों पहले प्रभाकर कोर्टे ने दिया, मणिकौल स्मारक व्याख्यान कुमार शाहनी ने दिया, दयाकृष्ण स्मारक व्याख्यान अनन्या वाजपेयी ने दिया और आज सितांशु यशश्चंद्र अज्ञेय व्याख्यान देने जा रहे हैं। ये व्याख्यान इन व्यक्तियों पर केंद्रित नहीं है, इनके बहाने हैं। आप चाहें तो इनका उपयोग करें, चाहे तो ना करें, ये स्वतंत्रता व्याख्याता पर छोड़ दी जाती है। अज्ञेय के बारे में इस मंडली को बताना कोई आवश्यक नहीं है कि हिंदी के जो कुछ कालजयी लेखक हैं उनमें से एक हैं और ये थोड़े दुर्भाग्य की बात है कि जिस शहर में उनका काफी लंबा वक्त बीता उस शहर में उनको याद करने का उपक्रम बहुत कम होता है। तो इसलिए हमने ये व्याख्यानमाला शुरू की और अज्ञेय ने एक बड़ी प्रसिद्ध पंक्ति है, आप सब जानते हैं, अभी कुछ और जो कहा नहीं गया। तो एक अभी कुछ और होगा जो उनके बहाने या उनके बारे में कहा न गया हो। और एक पंक्ति ये भी है कि फिर मुझ बेसब्रे से रहा नहीं गया। तो उन्होंने अपने लिए कही है, पर मैं भी इस मामले में थोड़ा बेसब्रा हूँ। मैंने सोचा कि अब हमको याद करने का यत्न करना चाहिए। हालांकि याद करने का काम तो औरों के लिए भी करना चाहिए, शमशेर बहादुर सिंह के लिए भी करना चाहिए, फिरोज के लिए भी करना चाहिए, इत्यादि इत्यादि, पर वो अलग प्रसंग है। हमारे आज के व्याख्याता, और ये थोड़ा उचित ही है कि हम, इसका कारण ये नहीं है कि हिंदी में बोलने वाले कम बचे हैं, हालांकि वो भी एक कारण है कि हम इस व्याख्यानमाला की शुरुआत गुजराती कवि सितांशु यशश्चंद्र से कर रहे हैं। सितांशु यशश्चंद्र हमारे बहुत पुराने मित्र हैं, तो अव्वल तो हम मित्रों को ही चुनते हैं। ऐसी कोई व्याख्यानमाला बताइए जिसमें लोग शत्रुओं को चुनते हैं। तो बहरहाल डंके की चोट पर अपने मित्रों को चुनते हैं। हमने उनसे आग्रह किया कि आप आए। वो बहुत सारी चीजें एक साथ कर चुके हैं। वो सौराष्ट्र विश्वविद्यालय के कुलपति रह चुके हैं, वो अतुल डोडिया और ज्योतिन्द्र जैन इत्यादि के सहपाठी और मित्र रह चुके हैं। वो उन्होंने बहुत सारा इन दिनों वो साहित्य अकादमी के गुजराती सलाहकार मंडल के क्या कहते हैं संयोजक हैं इत्यादि। तो उनका जीवन काल और कृतित्व बहुत विशद है, उसके बारे में आप सबको बहुत अधिक बताना आवश्यक नहीं है। हम बहुत कृतज्ञ हैं रजा फाउंडेशन में कि उन्होंने ये पहला व्याख्यान देना स्वीकार किया। और जैसा कि आप जानते हैं, अस्य सर्गविधौ ये इसका शीर्षक है, कंसर्निंग सम इंडियन आइडियाज ऑन प्रोडक्शन ऑफ पोएट्री। बहुतों को पुलिस ने रोक लिया होगा, कुछ लोग बीमार हो गए होंगे, स्वयं बीमार न हुए होंगे तो बीमारों की सेवा शुश्रूषा में लगे होंगे, कुछ लोग गाली गलौज पड़ोसियों से कर रहे होंगे, इसीलिए वो यहाँ नहीं आए हैं। लेकिन आप जो आए हैं, हम आपके बड़े कृतज्ञ हैं कि सब के बावजूद आप आए हैं, क्योंकि हम आश्वस्त हैं कि आप एक बेहतरीन व्याख्यान इस समय भारत के श्रेष्ठ कवियों में से एक सितांशु यशश्चंद्र से सुनने जा रहे हैं। सितांशु, आप
મિત્રો का तो हूँ गुजराती में बोली सकूँ, या तो आप मेरी बात हिंदी में सुन सके तो बेहतर हो। और ऐसी ही एक भारतीय साहित्य सृष्टि की ओर हम बढ़ना चाहते हैं, लेकिन अभी तो हम वहाँ नहीं हैं, और न तो आपका गुजराती इतना अच्छा है कि मैं गुजराती में बोलूँ तो आप समझ सके, न तो मेरा हिंदी इतना अच्छा है कि मैं जो कहना चाहता हूँ वो सुचारू ढंग से और निश्चितिपूर्वक मैं कर सकूँ। ये निश्चितिपूर्वक ही ये मेरा संस्कृत शब्द है, उसके लिए कुछ हिंदी अच्छा शब्द होता है, लेकिन मेरे पास अभी है नहीं। तो ये हमारी मर्यादा हमारी सबकी कि हमारी मातृभाषा है एक दूसरे से काफ़ी दूर हो गई है। वो मर्यादा के लिए खेद व्यक्त करके मैं अभी जो ये भाषा है अंग्रेजी, उसमें थोड़ा सा गुजराती मिलाकर आपके आगे रखता हूँ। The title is Asya Sargavidhau, concerning some Indian ideas on production of poetry. Friends, I would like to say a warm thank you to the eminent artists, writers, critics, discerning Saradayas here in this room, and to Raza Sahib, Ashok ji and other trustees for inviting me here today to give the Agyeya Memorial Lecture. I am grateful for your gracious invitation and for your august presence. The main concern of my talk is with Indian literature and Indian poetics, specifically with some details of a complex relationship between theories and practices of poetry in India. Indian writers and readers of literature have always had such a daunting freedom of choice and so much to choose from regarding both the materials, the mediums, and the technologies of both production and consumption of literary texts, that one would be hard put to find many, if any, parallels in the world of literary cultures. Even the three meta-narratives on archetypal authors that India has produced, the stories of how Valmiki, Vyas and Gunadhya produced their literary texts, indicates the width and complexity of Indian understanding of literature. We would come to those three archetypal tales a little later. But jumping from the distant past, let us come to the present times, which have perhaps become as distant to us as the former. And let me strike an entirely personal note on how I feel when I come to Delhi. I beg your indulgence with the reassurance that the note would probably not sound as much out of place at the end as it might sound at the beginning. Well, what I want to say is that when I traveled from my hometown of Vadodara to Delhi, I sometimes, but only sometimes, feel that I have come from an ill-defined periphery to a dominant center. I've been wondering about this experience for quite some time. Why does the journey to Delhi make me feel like that? Is there something about the travel in itself that goes wrong? Or the time of the year, like 15th of August, for example, or the day central government budget comes out? After much musing, I've come to believe, tentatively, that it has to do with whom I meet in Delhi. As the Vedas say, Rupam Rupam Pratirupo Babhuva. He assumed the form of each form he touched, which is so realistically true about fire. And in reversal, for people like us from the periphery. Because we have to become like him. Like him is nothing. It has also something to do with where in Delhi I meet those persons. Because Delhi is a large place, And some people behave differently at different places, like the Alankaras in different poems, as you know. And it depends on my own errands too, of course. When I am on some administrative errand, including literary administrative ones, the feeling of Gujarat being on a periphery, a border state, as they say, or on the margins, such a feeling comes up more frequently. Delhi contains certain locations in Delhi seem to fashion themselves up as locations of power, domination, immobile and immobilizing. For that reason, I sometimes have to extend my stay here. Now, what has that to do with poetry and poetics, you might well ask? Or with my being invited, probably through some mistake, you would think, to the Raza Foundation to give the Agyeya Memorial talk? Well, let me conclude my apparent digression, that too at the beginning of the lecture, I'm sorry, by saying that I did not have that kind of feeling of peripherality this time around with this Raza Agyeya event. Why, you might ask me, so do I. I ask myself why I do not feel being on the margin when I come to a place related to Raza, Ashok and Agyeya. Because the greatness of their work or goodness of their person? Perhaps not. But look, that's because I suddenly realized when I finally got to know what his paintings are all about, I said that's because Raza turns centers into bindus. And he hears Ashok Vajpayee wondering to himself what he should take from the center with him when he goes back to meet his mother living at the edge of time somewhere on the periphery. Then Raza turns the sign and cipher of a dot from being a center to become a bindu. The whole of Delhi changes too, including the north and the south blocks. How then, I ask myself, does an artist urge an immobile and immobilizing center to move out of its sterile zone of dominance, its headquarters of power, to turn itself into a bindu, that is, a site where life is born, and a site where reality is reborn as humanity and as art. With an apology to Paul Klee, I would say that a bindu is a center that is taking a walk, that has come out of its office in Parliament for a stroll in the meandering streets of India. One remembers Nietzsche, who said that art is born when Apollo finally speaks the language of Dionysus. I'll leave it at that for now, having found an answer to one of my anxieties as a visitor from Vadodara, but also as a reader of Indian literature, written and or spoken out in many languages, at many times, in many ways, at many places. But let me complete this introduction to the main theme of the talk with a quotation from Agyeya. As the poet's words on paper complement the painter's strokes on the canvas. Speaking of domineering hold of power of tradition in India, he says, यह भारतीयता आकर है क्या? किसी भी सांस्कृतिक परंपरा से अनुप्राणित होकर आगे बढ़ने के लिए आवश्यक है कि प्रत्येक व्यक्ति यह प्रश्न पूछे, उसका उत्तर अपने में पाए, उससे जो भी गद्यात्मक प्रेरणा मिल सकती है उसे आत्मसात करे, क्योंकि परंपरा कोई पोटली बांधकर रखा गया पाथेय नहीं. Indianness and Indian tradition could turn into a rigid and exclusive center, pushing all deviations, innovations, and new beginnings into margins and beyond. Agyeya has significantly issued this warning against it and suggested his option in a book titled Atmanepadi. Let us go look for such Atmanepadi locations in the multilingual, polysemic and open-ended tradition or traditions of Indian poetics, and let's be on lookout for the Parasnaipadi. You must have noticed, friends, that my attempt here in this 1 hour long talk is not to present history of Indian poetics in a nutshell. That would require me to be a much bigger nut than I really am. The effort here is to look at the underpinnings of Indian poetics. Sometimes it is more fruitful to look at the assumptions and aspirations of a literary tradition in actual practice, in creative texts, than in prescriptions in critical theories. A verse from Kalidasa's play, Vikrama Urvashiyam, could be a good place for this, and to figure out what are some underpinnings of Indian theories of literature. In the first act of the play, after he has rescued the lovely Apsara Urvashi from her abduction by Danavakeshi, King Pururava is bringing her back in his flying chariot. Urvashi is still unconscious from the trauma, but looks so lovely that Pururava, alone with her in the sky, wonders to himself how so much beauty could have been engendered. Who could have fathered her? He wonders. Asya Sargavidhau Prajapati Rabut Chandronu Kanta Prabha. The other version is Chandronu Kanti Prabha. Asya Sargavidhau Prajapati Rabut Chandronu Kanta Prabha. Shungare Karasa Swayam Numadana Masonu Pushpakara. In the act of creation of this lady, was it possible? Possibly the moon of endearing luster, the creator, or was possibly Cupid himself, whose one sentiment is love, the creator, or was possibly the month, the mind of flowers, the creator? This translation is from A.B. Gajendra, and I love Marathi translations of English or Sanskrit into English. The figure of speech, Alankar, employed here is Sasandeh. A doubt has been expressed here about how such a splendid beauty, Manohar Idam Rupam, could have been created. Let the king worry about the nature of Urvashi's beauty. Let us ask, what is the nature of king's doubt here? And of Kalidasa's Sasandeh Alankar. Rajarshi Pururava, a friend of King of Indra, certainly does know the story of the birth of Urvashi. The next two lines of the same soliloquy clearly indicates that when he says, how possibly would the ancient sage, who is dull on the account of his study of Vedas and whose interest in the objects of senses is lost, be able to create this form? Veda Abhyasa Jala Kathannu Vishayam Vyavritta Kautuhalo Nirvatum Pravayan Manohar Vidam Rupam Purana Muni. He was permitted in his own time to use the word Vedabhyasa Jada. I wonder if I use some such word for Veda or Quran or Bible or some such Guru Granth Sahib, what will happen to me? She has lost freedom after political independence. Now look at the situation from the point of view of the audience. The Samajika seated before the stage and listening to Pururava's word would have already known about has already been told by Sutradhara, who at the very beginning of the play hears some commotion off stage, then looks and finds out that the wailing comes from other apsaras because Urud Baba, the Rasakasya Mune, Surastri, Bandi Kruta. Urvashi, the divine lady, born from the thigh of the sage Narayana, has been taken prisoner. Everybody, the director, the audience, the characters, everybody already knows the full story of how Urvashi was born. And yet, the king wonders to himself, why? and the audience listens and understands. Why? How? Is it all only for what some calls literary embellishment, for mere alankara, which according to Vishwanath of Sahitya Darpan is Kataka Kundaladivat, merely external and additional to the making of poetry? The questions are not only about creation of Manohara Rupa of Urvashi. The questions are asked by the king are also asked by the poet. And the questions are not about the birth of Urvashi. They are about birth of poetry. Now the question is not who could have fathered Urvashi. The question now is whether a literary text could be born only once, when the author wrote it down. Or can it be born like Urvashi of Pururvas several times? Become not only Vijottama but also Bahujanmottama, subject to well-structured but open-ended hermeneutics. We might see in this light the popular belief in Indian literary culture to add many prakshepas to major literary texts. And what is more, adding more new points to the corpus of writing of major poets like Meera and Narasimha, well after their death, by just adding half a line, Meera ke Prabhu or Bade Narasimha. The reading and listening Indian public has never objected too much to this practice, if the edition was not unworthy of the original. This also raises questions for writing of literary histories in Indian literary culture. The question of production of poetry cannot be dissociated with the questions pertaining to three other kinds of productions in a given literary culture. These are the problems of one, production of a literary language which constitutes and structures the poems and become vehicles of it. For example, Gujarati language was not there. Kanyadar Munshi says in his history of Gujarati literature that one single language was spoken in 13th century from Patan to Surat. No evidence. It's a wish. Young Jain monks born in Rajasthan and turned into monks at early age would study under Hemachandra and Vadi Devasuri in their gachas. They would study prosody and grammar and other texts. They were Jains. Hemachandra had already written the three Anushasanas, including Chandra Anushasana and Kavya Anushasana. But in all the Jain gachas, the Jain Munis would teach the Jain pupils Kavya Prakash of the Kashmiri Pandit. This was the ethos. And then these young boys would be permitted to write Churanika or Churan in Sanskrit. Once they wrote this well, then in the 13th century, for the first time in history of Gujarat, they were permitted to write didactic songs in the language of the people. The songs would be didactic or narrative of Nalakatha and Bharateshwar Bahubali Katha. Then they would go from Rajasthan, Sachor, Jhalor and so on, to Patan, to Khambhat, to Ahmedabad and so on. And they would be reciting the same written Gujarati. That is how gradually a standard Gujarati language came into being. Production of a poem and production of a language, especially modern Indian languages, I do not solicit here about Sanskrit, but one wonders what happened. And Sheldon Pollock has this thesis on the three Shiladikars in Gujarat. I am not going to that. But second is production of language, which is both the vehicle and the structure of a given poem. Second, production of a literary universe or or a literary region or territory in which a given poem and other related texts are to be located, circulated, produced and consumed. And of course 3, production of the poet and the reader or the listener. While common sense would ask us to put number 3 at number 1, a closer look at any Indian literary culture would caution us against any fixed order among literary text, literary language, literary region and author and reader. But in the time available, it might not be possible to discuss that issue any more than just raising it. One of the questions that links us with some questions listed above is the first poet or the Adikavi question. Are Adikavis born or are they made? One of the important distinguishing features of Indian poetics comes from its multiple myths of origin of literature. As we have noted, the most recognizable of them are the stories of Valmiki, recorded by the Adikavi himself in the Adikavya. No one in Indian literary culture, in Sanskrit or any other language of literature, has, so far as I know, disputed that. But many have simply added to it, giving Indian literary culture a rich heritage of many Adikavis. Thus, in Telugu literary culture, Valmiki continues to hold that title. It is also given to the 11th century poet Nannaya, the celebrated author of Mahabharata. This does not alter the status of the original author of Mahabharata, Vyasa, who indeed remains the original poet without being Adi poet. But the process does not end there. Within Telugu literary culture, there are other Adikavis. Somanathudu, the Veerashaiva poet, the author of Basava Puranamu in the 13th century, is also acknowledged as Adikavi in Telugu canon. In a well-researched essay, V. Narayana Rao has discussed this multiplicity, which goes beyond Somanathudu also. There are many Adikavis in there. 4. In Gujarat, the title of Adikavi is given almost universally to Narsi Mehta, who lived in around 14th century to early 15th century. But the history of that narrative is as interesting as any other. The term Adikavi was first used in Gujarati by the pioneering post-medieval author Narmada Shankar Dave, Narmad Posha. Narmad's book, Kavichari, in 1865, was the first history of a modern Indian literature in any language. Rangamati Nayana Ratna's Bengali literary history, Bangala Bhasha or Bangala Sahitya Vishayak Prastav, came out in 1872. Narmad used the word Adikavi for Narsi Mehta for the first time in Gujarat. But probably as he discovered that there was a long tradition of over 2 centuries of production of literary text, mostly by Jain poets in Gujarat, Narmad dropped the title of Narsi for Narsi in the second edition of Kavichari. But the name stuck on and continues to be used in popular literary discourse in Gujarat even after Narmad dropped it. Because it is not the precision. There is something else which is going on in the Indian mind. What we produce is not this kind of precision. That who was first, who was second, and so on. It's okay. Don't be so hung up on that. There are many articles. So, any problem? That's how Indian mind is. But there were Jain poets, but we still want to call Narsi Mehta Adhikari. Do you mind? That's how. It's another mode of thinking, another mode of production. Other regional languages also may have their own literary cultural production sites where their Adhikavis might have been produced. But let us look once again at the major trans-regional scene. Valmiki's own words, spoken out in surprise at his own composition of the first verse, that is Mahanishad, and so on, have been noted down by the poet himself. Kimidam vyapitam maya. What did I just say? He is surprised by the words coming out he is surprised by by his own words coming out in perfect meter. The great significance of this surprise, Valmiki's own surprise at his own composition, is perhaps yet to be fathomed. What does it tell us? Perhaps many things. It tells us that he was not trained in prosody, or perhaps that in any of the skills required for production of poetry. There is a long tradition of Kavya Shiksha, training of the poet in India, not only in Sanskrit. Brajabhasha, in the later times, had such an extensive tradition of Kavya Shiksha that Rao Lakpat Singh of Kutch established a Brajabhasha Pathshala in Bhuj, his capital, in the 18th century. The first of the 6 acharyas of Brajabhasha Pathshala Bhuj were all Jain monks, pointing out to the long tradition of Kavya Shiksha in Gujarat, probably originating in Patan of Hemchandra. This perhaps speaks of a country. So, how did yet the canonical Adikavi of Indian literary culture, so recognized by all subsequent poets and critics not only in Sanskrit but in other Indian regional languages, himself is surprised at having composed a perfect shloka, which he continues with great skill throughout the Mahakavya. This perhaps speaks of a continuum of a larger cosmic rhythm of which Sir was saying yesterday. Cosmic rhythm expanding from a greater rhythm into the flow of human speech. But at a more practical level, Adikavi's statement, Kimidam Vyahtam Maya, also points out to a continuum of prosody and poetics, Chanda Shastra, Alankar Shastra, from place-free, trans-regional literary cultures, Sanskrit, Prakrit and Abhavansha, into place-specific regional cultures of India. Earliest literary texts outside Sanskrit, Prakrit, Abhavansha and Tamil were composed in Kannada. One of its earliest texts, Kaviraj Marga, a book on poetics and prosody. Its author, Sri Vijaya, is recognized as, quote, God indeed of Kannada literary culture. He virtually created that culture. And this is said by none else than D.R. Nagaraj. Nagaraj notes with great perception that Kaviraj Marga, quote, reveals the structure of conflicts, compromises, and transformations that shaped Kannada literary culture. As Nagaraj has noted, the Kaviraj Marga has traditionally been described as a translation of Dandin's Kavya Darshan. But one would have to expand, Nagaraj says, to a breaking point, the scope and the idea of translation to cover the range of objectives of Kaviraj Marga. Sri Vijaya was a theorist of literature at the court of Rashtrakuta king Nripatunga, a court that could be described as a perfect model for courtly culture. It is a court that lies at the very heart of this text and fixes the outer limits of its enterprise. D.R. has drawn attention to how this involves a certain statist rejection of indigenous forms and of expressions. Now, there is rejection, but there is also acceptance. Nagaraj's position is also not tenable, nor is a position that everything was given on a platter to the modern Indian languages by Sanskrit, Prakrit and Abhavansha, nor is that tenable. Something else happened, and we are trying to figure it out. How is poetry made in India in this particular sense? The meta-narrative of Gunadhya's Brahad Katha brings this issue into sharp focus of this conflict and so on, transformations. Gunadhya is, in this sense, the opposite of the courtly poets like Sri Vijaya. He is also, unlike Valmiki, who is surprised at an element of his own technology of production of poetry that prosody derived from older standard literary culture. Gunatya, on the other hand, was twice expelled from royal courts. First from the divine royal court of Shiva for eavesdropping while Shiva was telling a story to Parvati. When punished by Shiva and ordered to go to the mortal world, which is now called India, Gunatya was once again banished, this time from the mortal's royal court, for failing to teach the king Sanskrit. So Gunatya was an expert in Sanskrit. Then he composed, as we know, Brihad Katha in Paishachi, that no one would read. With the rest of the story of production of Brihad Katha, its near total destruction by the despairing author himself, and its final, if partial restoration by the courtly culture of Sanskrit language, that is familiar to you all. I would, however, like to draw attention to one detail, which is significant for our discussion of technology of production. It is interesting that Valmiki produced and circulated the canonical text Ramayana entirely in the oral mode. Lava and Kusha too recited it after learning it by heart through listening to it. Yet, it is the originary canonical text of the tradition of the written literature of Indian tradition. But Brihad Katha, which is not quite a part of written literary culture, is more and more associated with the marginalized tribal forest culture, but it was actually written down by its author. Valmiki, a tribal, produced Adi Kavya for the mainstream literary culture, and Gunatya, member twice over of a divine and mortal court, authored a work that he was not even allowed to write in the language of the court. He became a canonical figure for the other tradition. These are the plays that you find in the literary culture and culture of India. And these are the plays you must listen to carefully. We speak too much before our texts. So the texts are not able to speak. We have learned so many lessons from the moderns and the postmoderns of European culture that we are ready, like Arjuna, with an inexhaustible bunch of arrows. And we go to these texts with such arrogance. You were saying yesterday how arrogant the Harvard professors were. We have inherited that arrogance. First, we don't even know almost anything of practical evolution, little of Sanskrit, hardly anything of other languages of India. So our basic equipment is so low, and our theoretical competence has become so high because it's been borrowed from another tradition. So there is a crisis. And I would like to place this crisis before you, or you have already done it yesterday in your very brief introduction. So please. And what a contrast do two iconic and archetypal Indian authors, Vyasa and Gunatya, both from the tradition of writing rather than of speaking, offer. The meta-narrative of Vyasa combines speech and writing. Vyasa speaks but makes sure that Ganesha writes. The scribe has a condition. The human poet, the divine scribe has a condition. The human poet should keep pace with the divine scribe. The poet, as you know, puts a counter condition. The divine scribe should first understand what the human poet has said. Now, this is confidence and not arrogance. This is human confidence. That you will not be able to, you might be Ganesh, but you will not be able to understand a few things that happen. It will take a little while for you. This kind of camaraderie and robustness that you find in Vyasa is contrast to Gunatya. So, this indeed is a strange condition suggesting that there is something in human expression, human emotions and thoughts that is not so easily accessible to the gods. The archetypal image of Vyasa and Ganesha together transforming oral tradition into written one, thus producing hybrid text called Mahabharata, contrasts sharply with the exiled Gurante, alone amongst animals, away from human habitat, writing with his own blood on leaves from the trees around him. These are the archetypal images. And if we imbibe them, we understand our contemporary situation so much better. We'll come to that. That Indian literary culture has these three octal arc images of poets at work should enable us to under our own contemporary literary culture. Writing from locations that once were most marginal or beyond the margins of the page of Indian poetry. Writing from those margins, the Dalits, women, tribals, the disabled, societies listed in government records as criminal societies, Vicharti Jati, immigrants from peripheries of the present day India, like South Asians from Tibet, and on the other hand, the privileged groups that have chosen to live full-time or part-time outside India and write in English about India. All these diverse, all these different agents, modes, and media of literary creation should and could be read critically and included in the large literary cultural space that India has produced so imaginatively, intelligently, and carefully over centuries or millennia. A greater and more realistic awareness of this large space needs to be cultivated in our literary cultural world today. Sheer ignorance and fatal arrogance is spreading fast into this space. Economic and political forces are active in erasing much from this richly interactive space, producing mutual antagonism amongst languages and subcultures that have been in mutually enhancing interaction in a semiotic network that is perhaps matchless in its virility and openness. However, a dangerous mixture of arrogance and ignorance has resulted into release of forces fatal to strength and spread of this semiotic space. I would like to discuss two publications of Indian literature by two important publishers, one national, the Sahitya Academy, and the other international, the Oxford University Press. Sahitya Academy, New Delhi, India's National Academy of Letters, has published a voluminous history of Indian literature in 8 volumes, edited by Professor S.K. Das. It is not for nothing that so much space was required for it. The reason lies in the absence of boundary that the editor has accepted for his notion of literature or Indian literature. This history of literature includes, to quote the editor's words, and now I quote, all memorable utterances ever made in India. For this history, literature includes, again I quote, all major texts. Literature, not Vangmaya, Sahitya. Literature includes all major texts, which means that everything written or spoken in any language of India, if it could achieve the status of being major, is included in this 8 volumes of history of Indian literature. That category would include, according to Das, again I quote, fairy tales and tales of adventure, songs of various types, and nursery rhymes. French philosopher Jean Baudrillard has discussed a story by Georges Louis Borges in which the cartographers of the empire draw up a map so detailed that it ends up exactly covering the whole territory. Professor Das seems to have done that. One could pick up Professor Das's history of Indian literature instead of that map. The Oxford University Press has published in 2003 a book titled South Asia, a Historical Narrative. It is authored by Muhammad Yunus and Aradhana Parmar, both professors teaching in USA. You bet. The former, a distinguished diplomat, one is teaching there, the other is a distinguished diplomat from Pakistan. The book has been described by Oxford University Press as, quote, the core text for colleges. Being a historical narrative, as its title says, the book proceeds to find a beginning of the narrative. Now, here, Adi Kavi and Adi Grantha is most unusual. In chapter 2, chapter 2 of the book is titled The Beginning. It begins with the words, again I quote, to begin with the very beginning, let us go back to the very beginning, let us go back to the creation of the universe by the Big Bang. I can't really. About 15 billion years ago, Dinesh and Parmar, 2003, page 7. The authors then give an interesting description of, quote, molten lava and, quote, the cooling tectonic plates swimming over it. It is interesting that the beginning has been discussed in chapter 2, while chapter 1 is about, quote, evolution of the term India. The author begins the book by noting that, quote, Bharat, B-H-A-R-A-T, without an A. Bharat in Sanskrit, Hind in Persian, Indica in Greek, or Hind in Arabic, and Hindustan in Urdu and Hindi correspond to the English term India. The authors associate the naming of the land with conquest by a political power. Thus, quote, in the Vedas and other Sanskrit literature, Veda is also literature. In the Vedas and other Sanskrit literature, the term Bharat carries, without A, the term Bharat carries the legacy of Aryan triumph in the Battle of 10 Kings, mentioned in the Rig Veda. That took place over 3,000 years ago. Unquote. It is good to note that Oxford University has finally solved the question of dating Rig Veda. The question, quote, my question, which non-Aryan the Aryans triumphed over in the Battle of 10 Kings, remains unasked and unanswered. However, the two historians have noted another name for the region, Bharatavarta. There is page 2, Bharatavarta. The authors do not give any source for this new name. The name Bharatavarsha is not mentioned here. Narrating the triumph, the narrative of the triumphs continue. Yunus and Parmar write, quote, for 2,000 years, Bharat remained in use in Sanskrit language, while successive conquerors named the country differently in their own languages. Just like the Aryans had done when they had become dominant in the southwestern region of the subcontinent. Subsequent conquerors also gave different names in their own languages to this part of the continent which they occupied. Those names began to replace the name Bharat in the literature of the conquering people. Unquote. The next paragraph begins with a switch from the note of triumph to the notes of survival. Probably the other author has come in. The quote, the Indian civilization and Hinduism, however, survived 2 millennia of these invasions, and the term Bharat survived with them. Subdivided into political contexts, but vibrant in Sanskrit literature. No details have been given on 2 millennia of these invasions on Hinduism and Indian civilization. OUP has announced on the cover page of the book that it is one of their, quote, core texts for colleges. In view of that, an open debate on the theoretical underpinnings, ideological assertions, and historicity of content of this book is necessary. OUP could consider taking this book out of further circulation till then. These two books remind me of what Jean Baudrillard, the French thinker, has said regarding a reversal of relationship between territory and the map in the age of postmodernity. Let's skip that. Our discussion began with a reference to Sargavidhau. Asya Sargavidhau. It then at that point referred to Urvashi. Let us conclude with another verse by the same poet. It is from the Mahakavya Kumarasamma. It too refers to Sargavidhi. This for the birth of Kumar Kartikeya, who could lead the battle against oppression. Sargavidhi here includes tapas by Gauri, but also by Shiva. With long fasting Uma, as Kalidas says, Bhaghuva tasya kilaparana viti davuksha vritti yatirikasa. She sustained herself with nothing other than that which could sustain a tree. And with Shiva, Swayam Vidhata Tapasa Phalanam Kena Apikame Tapashchacha. One who is giver of all boons, did penance for some unknown desire. May our literary culture today come to know that Kena Apikama and that Parana.
You heard a brilliant lecture covering a very large area and proposing a new look at our own inheritance in terms of poetics, in terms of aesthetics, and trying to distinguish our tradition from other traditions which we seem to have got ingrained much more firmly than our own. Now there is some time for, normally memorial lecture should not have any questions, but I'm sure Sitanshu would. So if you have any questions or brief comments, and they could be in Hindi as well. पहला सवाल कोई पूछ ले, फिर धीरे धीरे बाकी की हिम्मत बढ़ती है।
मैं प्रमोद दुबे हूँ NCERT भाषा विभाग में। तो जैसा कि बड़ौदा के दिनों मैंने आपके मुंह से सुना है, हिंदी साधु भाषा है। मुझे HP भाषा पर पूरे जैन और अपभ्रंश प्राकृत की परंपरा के भीतर गुजराती के साथ इस साधु भाषा का स्थान आपकी दृष्टि में कहाँ है?
गुजरात में भाषा मध्यकाल यानी 19वीं शताब्दी के मध्य तक अनेक गुजराती कवि बहुभाषी कवि होते थे और वो ब्रज में भी लिखते थे और कुछ खड़ी बोली की पास वाली भाषा में भी लिखते थे। अखाने भी ऐसा लिखा है। कई लोगों ने तो पूरे ग्रंथ जिसे आप आज हिंदी कहते हैं उसमें लिखे हैं। हिंदी के जो स्रोत है वो स्रोत भाषाओं में लिखे हैं। वो तो 19वीं शताब्दी तक की बात है। राजेंद्र शाह का तो नाम आप जानते हैं, ज्ञानपीठ अवार्ड के हमारे विजेता, बहुत बड़े कवि है थे। हो सामर थोड़ी अखियन में जो बनी झूके लाल नागर सामरी, मेरी बीजे चोरी चुनरिया तो ऐसो रंग न डाल नागर सामरी। तो नंद लाल रो छकेल छोरो गायकू आयर बेटी, फूलन हार गले में दूजी हार रहेगी छेटी। ये राजेंद्र शाह की पंक्ति मुझे पूरा याद है, इतनी अच्छी है। अभी गुजरात में हुआ क्या, पूरे भारत में हुआ क्या कि कुछ स्वातंत्र के बाद के कुछ दशकों में हिंदी बड़ी एग्रेसिव बन गई, क्योंकि हमको ऐसा लगा कि ये लोग चाहते कि ये राष्ट्रभाषा हो। हमारे रेलवे में भी आप हिंदी बोले, इसमें भी, बैंक में भी जाके हिंदी बोलो। कोई हम गुजरात में हिंदी क्यों बोले बैंक में जाकर? वो भी गुजराती जानता है, हम भी गुजराती जानते, तो हिंदी क्यों बोले? फिर ऐसे बोर्ड लगा हिंदी बोलो राष्ट्रभाषा। तो बहुत कुसेवा की ये शब्द, हम तो हिंदी नहीं बोले, वो ऐसा बोर्ड हमने पढ़ा कि हिंदी मत बोलो, ऐसा बोलना। पिछले 4 दशक से हिंदी ने जो काम किया है मैं तो वो भावना का आदमी नहीं हूँ, लेकिन मुझे बड़ा भाव होता है उसके लिए। इतने अनुवाद किए हैं। मुझे असमिया कविता पढ़नी हो हिंदी में है, मुझे कन्नड़ गद्य पढ़ना हो हिंदी में है। कितना आपने काम किया। फिर देश विदेश की जो, जिसे आप थियरी को क्या कहते हैं, ना दूसरा एक शब्द भी है, विमर्श। अभी कोई विमर्श कहते हैं वो साफ जाने, क्योंकि प्रकाश और विमर्श तो कुछ अलग है, लेकिन विमर्श कहते हैं हिंदी में, ऐसे मजाक की बात है। तो लेकिन वो चाहे जो भी भाषा, जो भी संज्ञा का प्रयोग करे, लेकिन इतना अच्छा अनुवाद हिंदी में किया है, ये पूरे यूरोपियन भाषाओं में से। निर्मल जी को कल ही याद करते थे, उनकी क्या बात करें, तो कितनी मूल भाषाओं में से जानकर ये हिंदी ने किया है। इसके लिए गुजरात तो बड़ा कृतज्ञ है।
पड़ाव की या प्रस्थान बिंदु की बात की है, जबकि दंडी का जो काव्यादर्श है वो कन्नड़ में कविराज मार्ग में फ्री रेंडरिंग उसकी हो रही है। हम लोगों को पढ़ाया जाता था कि ये काव्यादर्श का अनुवाद है, लेकिन बाद में जैसा शेल्डन पोलक आदि ने उसको पढ़ के कहा कि वो अनुवाद नहीं है। और सिंहली में लगभग उसी समय सीए बसलकार नाम से काव्यादर्श का उसी तरह का रूपांतर होता है। दुर्भाग्य से ये दोनों ग्रंथ मुझे सुलभ नहीं है, और मैंने कन्नड़ में लोगों से कहा भी कि इनको अंग्रेजी अनुवाद या प्राप्त हो तो हम लोग देख सकें कि वो क्यों काव्यादर्श का उस तरह का रूपांतर 10वीं शताब्दी में कर रहे हैं, क्या सिनारियो पूरा है। तो आपसे मैं जानना चाहता था, क्योंकि ये मतलब पूरा कहीं ना कहीं से कुछ सिनारियो बदल रहा है कि वो दंडी को ही क्यों कर रहे हैं, वामन या वामन को क्यों नहीं कर रहे हैं, उस तरह की अलग तरह का रूपांतर उसका कर रहे हैं। तो वो किस दृष्टि से क्यों कर रहे हैं, उसमें काव्यादर्श की तुलना में क्या अलग है, ये मेरी जिज्ञासा रही, क्योंकि मुझे पुस्तक सुलभ नहीं है। और उससे पूरा कन्नड़ साहित्य, जो आपने कहा कि वो भगवान की तरह माने जाते हैं, तो कन्नड़ साहित्य बदल जाता है। दंडी इतने महान विचारक हैं, बहुत बड़े हुए हैं, उनसे वो नहीं हो सका, और उसका एक स्वतंत्र रूपांतर आने पर कन्नड़ साहित्य की नई धारा हो सकी। तो ऐसा उसमें क्या था, ये मतलब मैं जानना चाहता।
आपको कुछ बताने की स्थिति में तो मैं हूं नहीं, फिर भी गुजरात में जो इसका एक पैरेलल है वो आपके पास में रखूं। 1170 ईस्वी से पहले भरतेश्वर बाहुबली घोर नामक छोटा सा ग्रंथ भरत बाहुबली कथा पर वज्रसेन ने लिखा। उसके बाद शीघ्र ही कुछ दशक के भीतर भरतेश्वर बाहुबली घोर नामक चला। अभी इसकी काफी बहस हो रही है गुजरात में वाहिनी साहब के समय में भी, कि ये गुजराती में लिखने का, या जो उसका नाम तो गुजराती था ही नहीं, लेकिन ये बात संस्कृत प्राकृत अपभ्रंश पे लिखने की जगह ये बोलने वाली भाषा में लिखने का जो शुरू हुआ, कई लोगों का ऐसा मानना है कि पुराने भारत की सामंत व्यवस्था टूट गई, तो ब्राह्मणों को राजाश्रय मिलना बंद हो गया, तो फिर ये लोक भाषा में लिखा गया। दिलीप चित्र भी ऐसा मानते थे, वो तो ऐसा भी मानते थे कि अर्वाचीन भारतीय भाषाओं और संस्कृत के बीच बड़ी लड़ाई छिड़ी थी, और ये दिलीप चित्र तो बहुत अच्छे कवि थे, बहुत, लेकिन और देसीवादी तो कई अपने फंडों की फिक्र में लड़ाई छेड़ कर बैठ गए हैं। ऐसा कुछ था नहीं, तब तो चालुक्य का बड़ा शासन था, तब तो अभी तो सिद्धराज राज्य करते थे, उसके बाद तो कुमारपाल आए और भीमदेव अभी उसके बाद, और कितना रेजिस्टेंस किया था। वो दिल्ली से आया था, वो कौन से धर्म का था उसकी बात नहीं है, लेकिन वो प्रदेश के बाहर से आक्रमण आया था। तो वो तो आया तो उसके बाद आया, लेकिन जब ये पुरानी भारतीय व्यवस्था सुचारू ढंग से चल रही थी, जैन पंडितों को भी इतना बड़ा राज्याश्रय मिलता था, हेमचंद्राचार्य के ग्रंथ को हाथी पर लेकर राजा आगे चलकर नगर प्रवेश में आया था, ऐसा माहौल था। तो ये जो एक थियरी है तो वो तो ठीक नहीं है। मेरा ख्याल ऐसा है कि गुजरात के बारे में तो कि जैन और जैनेतर वो दोनों मतों के बीच, और जैनों में भी दिगंबर और श्वेतांबर, उनके बीच हेजमनी के लिए बड़ी कश्मकश हो रही थी। कर्नाटक तब दिगंबर जैन पंथालय में आई था और गुजरात श्वेतांबर था। मैं लड़ना कर्नाटक की लड़की थी और गुजरात की राजरानी और राजमाता थी। उनके दरबार में उनके क्या शब्द है, हिंदी इसलिए मैं नहीं बोलता हूँ हिंदी, उनका गुजराती बोलो मैंने तेज गए तो मैं आवड़ते नहीं तो नहीं हिंदी आनी चाहिए। तो उनके राज्य का सभागार में क्या कहते हैं, राज्यसभा में, क्या उनकी राज्यसभा में, यानी रानी की राज्यसभा में, रानी सभा कह सकते हैं। तो उसमें एक विवाद हुआ था और गुजरात की ओर से वादी देवसूरी कि उनके लेखक का नाम यशश्चंद्र है। तो अब तक मैं मानता था कि मेरे पिताजी का स्वयं का नाम है। अब तक मैं मानता था कि बड़ा संस्कृत नाम है, बाद में मुझे चला कि ये तो जैन नाम है। तो ये जो अभी तक असी नाम ताड़िमाने भी नगद जन मंदिर है, वो सब था। तो वो उसमें से वो दिगंबर, तो उसमें से वो लोक संग्रह के लिए शायद ये सारी कथाएं ये अपनी भाषा में आई, ऐसा मेरा ख्याल है, ऐसी मेरी समझ है।
If you look at the emergence of vernacular languages in Europe, there's something which Sheldon Pollock has done with great erudition and skill. One difference which I don't think Sheldon Pollock notes anywhere between the Indic and the European situation stands out for me. And that difference is that, firstly, in both the universes there was a tremendous need and longing for an overarching language.
Yes.
And when that overarching language broke down or became weak or became recessive, in the case of Europe, you don't have anything comparable to, let us say, French. See, you have Latin and then you have territorial languages. There is nothing like a spoken, what you in technical terms designate as a vernacular language, which also assumes, and this assumption of this overarching transcending role in the case of India is not mediated by a political imperative. These are very, very important facts which have a bearing, which I don't know in 1950, when the enterprise of building a new nation and Hindi as Rashtra Bhasha was undertaken, whether anybody had considered that or not. But I think this in the cultural history is a very, very significant fact. The other thing I wanted to comment was, I think you take very well and at its most seminal the question of Adi, because the idea of being able to locate a beginning historically is something which has got, via the Genesis story, so deeply embedded in modern discourse and something which modern discourse is not quite aware of. It is so deeply embedded, even though, I mean, if you look at, for example, some of the best historians of Europe writing about the very, very ancient period, I mean, say, take a thematic like the origin of writing, for example. And I have this great French historian, Botero, in mind. He says that every time we go to the earliest and the beginning, what stares us in the face is that there is something which precedes us. So what is being said is that as a historical embodiment, this question can never be discovered. But this permeates the categories of theory and discourse in such a forbidding and in such a dense way. And the way you have marked the difference between the Sahitya Academy volumes and is emblematic of that. It is really emblematic of that, because the two are representing something very different. And what Oxford University Press is representing carries the confidence of the imperium of modernity, which the Sahitya Academy text, even though it is published by a modern institution, it doesn't carry that confidence. It just stays as a narrative. That's right. Now, I don't want to take too much time, but I have a complaint and a discomfort about the usage of certain terms in your very insightful and brilliant lecture. And these two terms that I have in mind are production and consumer. That really distressed me. I saw no visa. I thought that something is written or composed,
Three interventions and the fourth correction. The three interventions were really good. About the fourth correction. In modern Indian languages, in their critical discourse, an excessive sentimentalism has entered. For a while in Gujarati, a person like Suresh Joshi was able to keep it in check, and Umashankar Joshi, in his own way, classical way, was able to put it in check. Now the journalists have taken over. They are called great writers, great thinkers, chintak, this and that. Now they speak with, they use terms like surgeon, and if they are not very happy with the word surgeon, they would say srujan, and so on. Hindi also I have heard this word srujan, srujana, and so on. I have been so fed up with this sentimental way of excessive lyrical mode of critical discourse that I wanted to move as far away from that as possible. If I moved too far away into the realm of consumerism, which must have offended you, I would try to correct myself, sir.
No, because it takes the human agency and the human presence completely out.
Sorry?
The use of the word production and consumption in a literary context, it takes the human presence in the word, without which a word cannot be.
True. But also, for example, nirmiti, nirman, nirmiti, these are the words in the Sanskrit discourse also. And it is not, sir, sir is stated right here, so, but is surgeon ever used Radhavarabji? Is Kavikarma is used, Nirmiti is used, but is surgeon ever used? I don't know how surgeon got into this.
Not surgically, yes.
But I would give full thought to it. It sounds kind of consumeristic. So try to find another place as far away from this sentimental language of criticism, but not. stubbornly into this. Thank you, sir.
So, for example, you have this great discipline of calligraphy in certain traditions. It is not a very powerful genre as far as Indian languages are concerned, except Urdu and Persian. Now, the difference, if you were to ask the question, what is the difference between somebody, and this has to be a human subject, repeating the same letter with his hand, and a computer playing with innumerable variations. And there is a very vital difference. And it is that vital difference which gives to calligraphy the standing of an art.
Let us also go into English language and see if the word production is always used in connection with machine. I do not know English language that well, but I would like to go into the history of the usage of the word production. Because nirmiti is certainly there. And, but let's look at it. Better languages have always to be looked at in the market.
Friends, with that we come to the end of the evening. The end of the evening here. Of course, the last part of the evening is still left to do whatever you want to do. Thank you very much for coming here. With this, we complete the 6th lecture in a 7-lecture cycle instituted by Raza Foundation. The next one has to be on Kelucharan Mahapatra. Fortunately, Padma Subramaniam has agreed to give that lecture, but we are not able to get a date. It has to be after the summers. We also run a program called Art Matters in India International Center. And on the 15th, we have a session on why have arts stopped talking to each other. And we have Prabodh Parik from Mumbai, Prerna Shimali, Sunil Kothari, Anuradha Kapoor, and maybe someone else, perhaps an artist, a painter or someone. And, so you are also welcome, except that starts at 6:30 sharp. The tea is at 6. So you are most welcome on the 15th of April at the multi-purpose hall, 1st floor in the India National Center. Thank you.
How did you come? I didn't know that you were here.
Just came today.
Opening, okay. Yeah, I'll be there. Yeah, at 11 o'clock. Yeah, exactly. Yes, yes. So, इसको बंद करना है